No. If you have a Bible and you'd like to follow along, please feel free to turn in it to chapter 24 of Luke's Gospel. This is where we'll be spending our time. And today I'll begin reading that Gospel in verse 36. Before we turn there, though, this is another one of those places where in the narrative of this Gospel you've got an enormous amount of theology being taught, all in one little capsule. We learn in this gospel narrative, this portion of it, we learn who Jesus really is. We also learn what it's like to walk with Him and what the contours of our calling might be as we move through this life. All of this comes from this little passage. And He also gives the people who are there that day a really cryptic message that we would do well to pay attention to in our time. Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading, as I said, in verse 36. While everyone was there saying these things, Jesus Himself stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." They were startled and they were all terrified because they thought they'd seen a ghost. But He said to them, "Why are you frightened, and why do these doubts arise in your hearts? Look at my hands and my feet. It's me. Touch me and see. A ghost doesn't have flesh and bones as you see me to have." When He had said all this, He showed them His hands and His feet. And while they still couldn't believe it because they were amazed and filled with joy, He said to them, "Do you have anything here to eat?" So they gave Him a piece of broiled fish, and He took it and ate it in front of them. Then He said to them, "These are the words I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything that was written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." So He opened their minds so they could understand the Scriptures. And then He said to them, "Thus it stands written that the Christ would suffer and would rise from the dead on the third day, and that the repentance for forgiveness of sins would be proclaimed in His name to all of the nations, beginning in Jerusalem. You are witnesses to these things. And look, I'm sending you as my Father promised that you would receive, but stay in the city until you've been clothed with power from on high." So this is the third of three scenes that Luke paints for us. He has us at the cemetery when the women show up. Then He has us on the road to Emmaus when Mary and Clopas are walking along dejected and leave Jerusalem because they just figure it's all over. Jesus is dead. He can't be the Messiah. He was crucified. They've given up on the whole thing and they're just going home. And then He's got us here in this upper room. And it's significant that they obey Him at this point, in my mind, because they don't have a clue what He means when He says you're going to receive power from on high. If somebody told me that, and I didn't have the New Testament, I was standing here today and said, "Rip, you're going to receive power from on high. Go home and wait in your bedroom until you receive it," I wouldn't have the slightest idea what they were talking about. The only reason that this is significant here is because they obey Him in this moment. This event, this resurrection event now has been told to them by Peter, and it's been told to them by the women, and it's been told to them by Clopas and Mary. But they still don't believe it. They just don't get it. They're waiting. They're there. They're gathered in this room. They're not gathered because they're having a potluck. They're gathered because they're afraid. Because they saw what happened to Jesus and they're thinking, I don't want that to happen to us. And so they're gathered together, I would think, like normal people would. You remember on 9/11, the church is filled up for that evening. People want to be together when something really incredibly bad happens. People don't want to be alone. And so here they are, the followers of Jesus. Jesus is dead. Let's all get together and support one another. I mean, that's how it looks to me. And their reaction is completely normal. Why should they think Him alive? We saw Him die. We are so steeped in our 21st century, Bibles in our hands, been in church all our lives since we were little, hearing about Jesus' resurrection. We're so conditioned to it that we cannot place ourselves in that place where these people were. They've got no mental matrix for this. Judaism doesn't give it to them. There's no resurrection in Judaism until the end of the world. So they're stuck here, and they're hearing these stories, these few people, Jesus is alive, and they're just saying, I don't believe it. Well, then all of a sudden He shows up in the room. And Jesus' response to them says some stuff to you and to me about who Jesus is. The first thing it tells you and me is there's something about being resurrected that's going to happen to you and me. John, who was there, the apostle, who was standing there when all this happened, who really didn't believe it either until he showed up. He says this in his letter. He says, "Dear friends, we're God's children now. What we will be has not been shown to us, but we know that whenever Jesus is revealed, we'll be like him because we'll see him as he is." How is he? See, that's a big theological thing. People think the resurrection, it's all kind of wispy. We don't think about it in terms of ourselves. But the Bible's very clear. How are we going to be when we're resurrected? We'll be like him. How is he? Well, he said, "Handle me and see. A body doesn't have flesh and bone as you see that I have." So we know we're going to have a body of flesh and bone when we're raised from the dead. What else do we know? We're going to have a body of flesh and bone that has supernatural capacities. Jesus, it says in the text, was just there. When he was with Clopas and Mary, he was just not there. Broke the bread and was gone. I guess the bread just fell down on the table, I guess. I mean, I can't imagine how that works. He broke the bread and then he vanished. So I guess the bread just fell on the table and they're sitting there scratching their heads thinking, what just happened? So this moment tells us that resurrection is bodily. That's very important. That's so important. Think about the disciples here for just a minute. Just imagine with me. Think about this. Let's say you're a disciple, I'm a disciple. All right? We see Jesus die in front of us on the cross. We're Jewish, and so we think, well, that's it. It's over. But then we're so 3.5 years we've followed him, right? If you do anything for 3 years, you're going to be kind of invested in it a little bit. You're going to be thinking to yourself, I don't really want to let go of this. It's all I've known for the last 3.5 years. I remember when moving back to Waycross after 18 years of traveling with 2 different Christian bands, and I think, now what? When we got back here, that's how I thought, now what? Well, that's what they're thinking, now what? All right? They look at this moment and they could have taken this a different way. When they were confronted with Jesus' death, they could have said, he spiritually rose from the dead. They could have said that. As a matter of fact, take it a step further and say, the Jews actually pulled the body of Jesus out of the tomb, wrapped up in the cloth, starting to decompose. They unwrap it and they say, here he is. So this idea that he's come back from the dead, you're crazy. And they say, you don't understand. He just spiritually rose. They could have said that. That would have been the easy way. How are you going to counter that? If I tell you that you go down to Moore's here at 2 o'clock on a Monday afternoon every week, one time at 2 o'clock on Mondays, there's a pink elephant sitting in the third row having lunch with everybody else there. And so you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to go check this out. That's weird. I'd like to see the pink elephant having lunch in Moore's. And you go there and you sit there from 2 to 2:30 and the pink elephant doesn't come. And then you come back and you say, Rip, where's the pink elephant? Oh, I forgot to tell you, it disappears when you show up. Right? So how do you argue against something like that? They could have done that. They could have said Jesus rose spiritually. Who's going to check that out? How do you verify it? How do you deny it? You can't. No, that is not the resurrection. The resurrection was bodily. Bodily. So think about if you were a disciple. Again, let's stick with this for just a minute. Play this game with me for just a minute. Let's say that you believed and that you were holding to it because you're invested 3.5 years of following Jesus. I'm going to stick with this spiritual resurrection. He came back spiritually. I know there's a body still in the tomb, but big deal. He spiritually rose from the dead. Would you be willing to die for that? I wouldn't. I mean, I'm not willing to die for Bigfoot, that there's a Bigfoot. Somebody comes to me with a gun and says, Rip, do you believe in Bigfoot? I'm going to say, what would you like for me to say? Whatever you think is what I think. I don't want to die because I say the wrong thing about Bigfoot, right? Well, the disciples were in the same boat. Are they going to die put themselves at risk of death, losing their property, their families, whatever they lose, over the idea that Jesus spiritually came back? I don't think so. You'd be a fool to do that. It'd be like dying for the pink elephant down there at Moore's. So this narrative, you've got this narrative where it just simply tells us that he was there. The disciples who saw him there have no reason whatsoever to make this stuff up. No reason. There's nothing in it for them. They're not going to increase their bank accounts. They're not going to increase their employment opportunities. They're not going to increase their fame. Nothing. In the Roman Empire, this was dangerous. And yet they're willing to do it. Notice too, Peter, even after Peter comes and says he's alive, they don't believe it. They just don't believe it. And then Jesus is there, and notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, I've heard people say this, I've heard believers say this. You know, Jesus, once he became resurrected, he was able to walk through walls. It doesn't say that anywhere. It just says he was there. That's a supernatural capacity that Jesus could just be there and then be not there and be here. And the Bible says when he appears, we're going to be like him when we're raised. I don't know what that really means, but I'll tell you, Paul gives us a whole list. If you read 1 Corinthians 15, he gives us the whole list of what a spiritual body is like. And then it's John, the eyewitness, who says when he appears, we'll be like him. A body of flesh and bone, a real body with supernatural capacities. And did you know, I don't have a degree in physics, but I know something about some physics. And if this little remote here, okay, if I'm holding that in my hand, do you know why that is? Because the atoms in here do not align with the atoms in my hand. The atomic structure is different, and the repulsion force in the atoms keeps this from falling through my hand. But if I had the capacity to align this remote with all the atoms in my hand, it would fall right through and violate no law of physics whatsoever. Now, I'm not saying that's how Jesus did it. I'm just saying physics gives us a way to say this could be. And according to John and the rest of the apostles, it was. So the Greek says here that they couldn't believe it because of joy. They were so happy they couldn't take it in. And I love what Jesus does. This is where we learn something about what God is like. You don't see Jesus rebuking them for their unbelief at all. What does he do? He says, here guys, reach out and touch my hands and my feet and see that it's me. Ghosts don't have flesh and bone. See, they were steeped in the history and the mythology of that day. And if a person showed up who had died, you knew they were still dead. Does that make sense? In other words, if you're in your bedroom some night and you're in this era of history and some person that has died shows up in your bedroom, you don't think they're alive again. You know the body's still in the hole, but this is an apparition. This is an after-death appearance of the person from the realm of the dead. That's why Jesus said, handle me and see, because that's what they all thought. That this is one of those apparitions that shows up. We're so grieved, and we know this is true. People, when they lose someone, they've been married for 50, 60, 70 years, whatever, and the person dies, the spouse might see an apparition of that person with them, but they don't think the person's alive. They think the person's dead. I'm just seeing them in the afterlife. That's why Jesus came and said, handle me and see. I'm not one of those. I am not a spirit. I have flesh and bone in my body. That is so important. And then he says, do you have anything to eat? I mean, I can't imagine an apparition asking for something to eat, right? It'd be like some of those movies we've got nowadays where the apparition eats. I forget what it was. I think it was might have been Hotel Transylvania, where one of the ghosts comes up to the table full of food and pulls it up like this and opens his mouth, and the food just falls through onto the ground. You know, it won't stay in there because he's just an apparition. Then Jesus does something even more remarkable here. All right, if I'm there and Jesus appears, and I've been with him 3.5 years, and I'm a little scared, I go up and I pinch him and I say, wow, it really is him. Then Jesus teaches them. Now, why would he have to do that? I mean, really, I would be totally convinced right then. I'm ready to go out and dance in the streets for Jesus being alive, because I saw him crucified, I saw him die, but now I'm handling him, so I'm convinced. I don't need any more evidence than I've got. Why did he teach them? He taught them because, I don't know about you in here, have any of you, think back in your history of living, have you had an experience in your life that was really peculiar? Do you look back on it and say to yourself, I wonder if that was real? I do. I have experiences like that. Since I've been a Christian, I've had experiences like that. They were very real at that moment. They meant a lot to me and still do, but they're in the distant past. What do we need besides the experience? We need something that says this experience is a real thing. How do we do that? Peter says this in his second epistle. He says, moreover, we possess the prophetic word as an altogether reliable thing. Some Bibles say the more perfect, more sure word of prophecy. You do well if you pay attention to it, as if a light shining in a dark place until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts. It's one thing to believe that the resurrection happened as a fact. It's another thing to believe in Jesus. There are people who believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but they don't believe in Jesus as their Savior at all. How do you learn that? Well, Jesus said it well. Remember the woman at the well, right? This Samaritan woman, Jesus is talking with her. She says, why are you talking to me? I'm a Samaritan, you're a Jew. And they go on back and forth, and the Samaritans believed that they would worship God in the temple at Mount Gerizim in the northern kingdom. And Jesus said, there's a day coming when you will not worship God on that mountain or this mountain or any other, but you'll worship God in spirit and in truth. All right? Jesus appears, you have an experience, I have an experience. The spirit part is taken care of, but what about the truth? I have to know that it's true. If I have an experience with God, I need something that tells me that that was God, right? How would I know? I mean, if I'm walking along one day and all of a sudden I have a vision of something, how am I going to know that's God? I can't, unless it's something that aligns with what I've already got. That's why Peter says the more sure word of prophecy, a light in the darkness. And I'll bet you when Jesus is here in this upper room, nobody got drowsy. Jesus is teaching, nobody gets drowsy here. Everybody stays really awake. Now this moment, I'm going to say, raises some questions for you and me who say we are followers of Jesus. If we're walking through this world and we're saying to ourselves, I'm a follower of Jesus, what does it mean? Well, Jesus offers us a clue about this. In Luke 20, he gets into a dispute with the Pharisees and Sadducees over resurrection. And he says something to them very significant, quoting God, who was speaking to Moses at the bush. I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, not I was. Why does he say it that way? Jesus says because he's the God of the living, that all live before God. What does that mean? That means for you and me, here we are in this moment. And if Jesus is alive, and we're saying Jesus is alive by the fact that we're here, then it's got to mean something to us. Do we think, let me ask you a question now. Don't answer it, but just think for a moment. Do you and I go to our daily affairs with Jesus as a companion and think to ourselves, when we come to some problem we can't solve, whatever that is, whatever sphere of competence we have, a plumber, an electrician, a police officer, a clerk, a cashier, an engineer, a scientist, whatever it is, you take any realm, do we approach Jesus when we come upon a problem and say, thinking to ourselves, I'm going to ask Jesus about this, who is with me here now, because he's the smartest person who ever lived? Do we think like that? Do we think about him in terms of our field of endeavor as him being the most competent person we could possibly appeal to? I don't think we do. I think we think about Jesus as the sage who gives us the spiritual things at church. But when we go out there, he's kind of not part of that experience anymore for us. That's a shame. That's just a shame. Sir Lionel Luckhoo. Have you ever heard of Sir Lionel Luckhoo? Anybody? I hadn't either until I read about him several years back. He's a British barrister, that is, a British lawyer. And he became a Christian as an adult. And he decided that I'm going to look at the evidence for Jesus' resurrection as a lawyer and see if I can believe it or not. In other words, this is the way most people become a Christian. They hear the gospel, they pray, Jesus comes, and they have that experience of becoming born again, and then the questions start to come, right? You start thinking, is that real? Is this real, what I believe? So Sir Lionel decided he was going to investigate the gospel and see if he could really believe it. Sir Lionel is the most famous British lawyer ever. He had 245 straight victories in court. That's a lot. I mean, and they were all acquittals. So he was a defense lawyer, and I stopped to think about that myself, and I think, I wonder if that's a good thing. I mean, some of these guys might actually have been the perp. You know, they might have actually done the thing that he got them off on, but still, you got to admire a lawyer who gets 245 straight acquittals. That's a pretty good lawyer. That's somebody who can think through things carefully, evidence and everything else, right? He says this, now this is incredible. He says, unequivocally, I say, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof, which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. Now that's Sir Lionel saying that. I'm going to say Sir Lionel went just a little too far. Do you ever find yourself walking through this world doubting that Jesus is who he said he is, or that you doubt that you know him? Do you ever find yourself doing that? I do. I'll find myself doubting. If there's no room for doubt, there's no room for you and me at all. In other words, if Jesus were to come into this room, burst the doors open, and come in glowing like we might imagine somebody would come back that way as, and do something amazing in here, I bet you we'd all be very convinced, wouldn't we? I would be. But that's not how it is it? I mean, we just prayed for all these people on this list, and we've been doing this for years, praying. I believe he hears us. But sometimes it's hard to hang on to that as people. It's hard because we don't have the physical Jesus right here to put his hand on our shoulder and say, I'm with you, it's all right. Peter. Think about poor old Peter here. I mean, he has got to feel responsible for the fact that Jesus got crucified. To some degree, right? He's probably thinking to himself, you know, when I denied him, if I'd have just gone in there and testified, do you know you could do that as a Jew? If the Jewish court was assembled, the Sanhedrin, and you were the defendant, that if somebody from outside, another Jew, came in there and testified for you, that meant a lot. Peter's probably thinking, if I hadn't denied him, I probably could have got him off. No crucifixion. So when Jesus comes back from the grave, I'm going to say Peter's probably a little nervous about that. I mean, he's happy, but he's probably a little nervous, right? I would be. I'm the one that probably had a lot to do with him getting crucified to start with. This is where we learn something about God for you and for me. You know, it's hard to walk through this world and not doubt. It's hard to walk through this world and not be confronted with the fact that what we say we believe about Jesus does not always fit what we experience in the world. Bad stuff happens. What's happening with Betty right now, what's happening to some of our bodies, what's happening to people we love, what's happening to J.D. Mixon and that family, all these things around us that beat against us and tell us You can't believe any of this. And yet, there's Peter. And what does Jesus do with Peter? He doesn't turn him away. He doesn't condemn him. He frees Peter from the weight of what Peter has done. And that's what he does for us. You and I, everybody in this room, we've done things, still doing some of them that we're very ashamed of. And we wish we could go back and fix. Jesus sets us free from that past every day to start over anew. And the only reason any of that could happen is because he did come back from the grave. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything, you got a question for me, you want to pray with me, speak with me after the service, talk